Shut up and sit down.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, joined by my good friend, Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Excited as always to be here, especially since today we're speaking with God himself.
That's right. We have God himself. Isn't that amazing? So we have grumpy old dude here. Grumpy, thanks for coming on the show.
Doing? Well, thank you. How you doing, fellas?
Hanging in there, not bad. I'm finally happy that we get to launch the show again, because I had to go MIA for about a month for summer school, and it was just way too much of a hassle to fit in time to record as well. So now that I'm free for another 2 months, back on the road. Now, you have an incredibly interesting history. I'm sure you've spoken about this at great length already, but would you mind giving a rundown for our audience who isn't well acquainted with you in regards to your history as a white supremacist? Because I was listening to you on David Worley, and you basically gave a whole rundown of it, and it is one of the most fascinating things I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Well, to try and sum it up, when I was 19 years old, I was an MMA fighter. I wasn't professional. I was semi-pro, and unfortunately, I had killed a man in self-defense. Because of my martial arts background, the jury in my trial found me guilty of first-degree involuntary homicide, and I was sentenced to 30 years in prison. I went to prison in the state of New Jersey for 12 and a half years. And while I was in prison, I became one of the founding members of a prison gang known as State Prison Skinheads. And along with that, I joined a religion known as Creativity. I was a member of the World Church of the Creator under Matthew Hale for almost 8 years. And my cat decided he wanted to visit. Yeah, I was a skinhead for 20 years, though. I had decided even before I went to prison that I was, pretty much done with religion. I went to Amherst Theological Seminary and studied to be a minister, and then became an atheist instead, because nothing in the Bible made sense once I studied it. The Church of the Creator is an atheistic religion. They are an anomaly in the atheist community because they are a religion. They do not believe in any god or gods, but they believe that the white race is their religion. As far as I'm concerned, they should be classified as a terrorist group as well as a hate group, because they have committed very, very serious crimes. There have been members that have gone on shooting sprees, and the leader of the church, when I was a member, Matthew Hale, is currently serving 40 years for trying to have a federal judge assassinated. It took me a long time to get out of that mindset, and I like to tell everybody that education is key. Studying, different sciences, evolution, genetics, things like that, and studying actual history is what got me out of that religion and eventually got me out of being a white supremacist altogether.
Grumpy, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, like I saw you on Dave's podcast. He's a great friend of ours, and that was one of the more interesting episodes I've ever listened to. You said that this is a quote unquote atheistic religion.
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting use of terms, because in my everyday dealings with people, everyone seems to want to lump everything under the umbrella of religion, even like from philosophy to ideas. But when I hear religion, I always hear superstition. And I mean, why would you call it a religion as opposed to an ideology? Because I think of ideologies as just a very, very rigid, very, very uncompromising network of ideas.
Yeah.
that gets its adherents to look at the outside world and just mangle their perception of reality to fit in that framework. And then the only difference I see is that religion involves superstition, whereas ideologies as a whole, which is an umbrella I would lump religion under, to be just following dogma without reason to give someone a good foundation as to what to believe in and what not to. Why would you call it one or the other?
Creativity is actually classified as a religion in the United States and a couple of other countries. I do believe they have lost that standing in some Western countries, but I'm not 100% sure. And the reason, I still call it a religion is because they do have their own religious books. They have a religious doctrine. Of course, it's, based around a lot of pseudoscience and pseudo history, but they do have their own religious practices. They have their own marriage rites. They have their own burial rites. They do ask that children, be baptized in a sense. They don't call it baptism, but they do confirm children into this religion at the age of 14.
One of the reasons I asked that is because we hear statements from people who argue for religion. And one of those statements is that atheism kills it. You look at communist Russia that was supposedly atheistic, but they're responsible for a wide scale murder of its own people. But we know that it wasn't a religious society, so that's why I called it an ideology. So
right.
Why would we want to confuse the terms in that kind of fashion?
Well, it is an ideology, but like I said, they do have religious practices and they do have religious books. They do not believe in any gods or, demons or heaven or hell. But because of the practices that they do have and the books that they do have, I would consider them a religion, a very harmful and misled or misguided religion, but still a religion nonetheless.
I see. Now, one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating about these sorts of hate groups is that many of them are atheistic, right? They don't worship any god or gods. And one of the topics of conversation that I've been increasingly interested over the past couple of years is the seeming innate need in human evolutionary psychology to yearn for something that is above them. So one of the things that a lot of religious apologists will argue for, which is, I'm certainly not a religious apologist. I think we're all atheists here. We're all anti-theists here, I would say. But one of the things that they argue about is that there seems to be some innate desire within our human psyche that yearns for something greater than us, that yearns for something that is either spiritual or religious or something around that nature. And so do you think that there is something ingrained within us that needs some form of thing to cherish as if it were a god, right? So in this case, you could say that the thing that they're worshiping, that they're cherishing above everything else is their identity. So do you think that there's something there?
Yeah, I think it's more that, we are social creatures and we feel a need to belong to something bigger than ourselves. And sometimes that leads people down a dark path, especially like in my case, and I can only speak for myself, but I know because of the things I did, I found people like me. They were young. They didn't really have an educational background. They were, from a broken home or angry or whatever. And then you get these older people that, pose things to you that you don't understand. And you think that they actually have some kind of real knowledge. And they tell you, hey, come over here. We'll make you our family. We'll take care of you. And then they start to indoctrinate you into these ideas. And it's a hard road to get out of that once you're in it, you know.
Mhm.
And like I said, I know I've personally, once I was into this religion for a couple of years and still in prison, I would see new guys come in that were, you know, 18, 19, 20 years old and came from broken homes, didn't really have that much of an education. And I would talk to them about this religion and tell them, hey, you're white. This is where you belong. And this is why. And I'd feed them, you know, the propaganda from this organization. And unfortunately, I brought quite a few people into that movement.
Mhm. What's interesting is that you said that, if I remember correctly, what broke you out of this spell was recognizing that there were some inconsistencies between
Yeah.
what they were telling you and what the general scientific consensus was. So what I've noticed is that within a lot of these groups, even if you were to give facts to people, right, about the nature of biology, about the nature of race, or if we're talking about religion, the nature of Genesis or abiogenesis specifically,
Yeah.
it doesn't really seem to faze them, because they're not in this religion for the sake of understanding reality through a scientific lens. There's a spiritual lens there that they prefer to look through. And we've had Rabbi Wolpe on the show, who is who's a rabbi, obviously, and he says that his justification for religion is not any scientific fact, nothing around those lines. It is just for the sake of understanding yourself through a spiritual lens,
Yeah.
and through that sense of community. So you think that that's the glue right there that holds everything together, either a community or coming up from a broken home and finding someone that embraces you.
Yeah, I think that the community, and like I said, the sense of belonging, the sense of being part of something that's bigger than yourself. And a lot of times, you know, these groups, not just the religion that I used to belong to, but, you know, the skinhead movement or any supremacist group really, you know, pushes the fact that you're doing the right thing. Don't listen to what other people tell you. This is what's right, you know, because this is going to save your tribe, your people, you know. And that's something that, you know, draws a lot of people in. If they think they're doing good, they don't want to hear that you made a mistake, because then they have to own that. They have to admit that they were wrong. And most people don't ever want to admit that they were wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you concerned at all about the fact that religion is declining, right? The United States is now the only first world country that is predominantly religious. Is there any concern that you have that as religion continues to decline, that we might see an increase in these identity-based groups?
No, I don't think I'm too worried about seeing an increase in these groups because of the religious decline. I do know that there are quite a few more hate groups in the United States right now in the past few years, and I don't think that has anything to do with people leaving religion per se. I think a lot of that has to do with people that know how to talk real well and conning younger people into joining these cult groups.
Mm-hmm.
Grumpy, in your podcast with Dave, you mentioned Stephen Hassan's work. We have a mutual friend of ours who's who is a former member of Antifa, who really introduced me to Stephen Hassan's work, and I've been looking into his byte paradigm. The third letter of that acronym, thought control. I thought that was particularly interesting, especially with the idea of like how they control, how cult leaders and people who control ideologies, they like to control how people think, and they do that by manipulating their use of language, loaded language, cliches, slogans, anything that just simplifies thought, that tamps down on critical thinking, or whatnot. Like, did you see this play out in when you were part of creativity? Like, how did this work? Like, could you give us some examples, and like, you know, what was your experience with it?
Yeah. Well, along with, the thought control is getting members to follow what is called the salubrious diet and salubrious living. Try and eat mostly raw, uncooked vegetables, nuts, and grains. It puts yourself on a workout regimen. Stay healthy and stay fit, and make yourself a model for others to follow. And along with that is, somebody like me who didn't really have that great of a vocabulary, and I still don't because I'm old and lazy, but that's besides the point. Read dictionaries and, study encyclopedias or whatever, and, learn how to speak better, learn how to talk to people better so you can communicate the message of our church. And they push that, keep talking about our message, our religion, our people. And you hear this over and over and over and over. And then you start to do it over and over. And when you do things repetitively, they become habit forming. And once they become a habit, well, they have control of your thoughts, because now you're thinking, I have to get more people into this group. I have to promote my religion. I have to promote my race. And it's just like any other religion. It's cherry-picked ideas. You tell people all the good things, but you don't mention anything that could be harmful, to, show how harmful your religion is.
Yeah. We see that happen with cults. I mean, like you used to practice MMA. I'm still a very, very avid martial artist myself, and in my experience, martial arts can be just almost like cult groups, in and out of themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I want to turn our attention now to what we call these social justice warriors, or as I prefer to refer to them, social justice extremists, or the woke. And I see this way they're using language to justify their activities. And I see a lot of similarities to what you're describing right here. I mean, like all three of us here are for social justice, and it sounds like in general we want what they want, but their methods are highly questionable and toxic. Yeah. One of those has to deal with the idea as how they're manipulating the dialogue, hiding behind what looks good, social justice on top, but like their methodologies are questionable, and they use phrases like white privilege, science is complicity, speech is violence to really funnel critical thinking. I mean, like white privilege seems to be the idea that you only succeeded because of your skin color. Silence is complicity. You don't have to. You're staying silent because you don't have an opinion on the subject matter yet. You want time to think things through. Yeah. Speech is violence. You offended someone, so therefore you would. That's the same as assaulting them. But that's all nonsense. So it's a cult, the way I see it. Wokeness is a cult that just is excusing its activities, again, between a narratives that sounds good, but it just really seems like they're just out to pull systems down and whatnot, and just hiding what it's really about behind catchphrases. Like, have you noticed this in your encounters with extremists?
Yeah, I've had people tell me, well, I'm black, I can't be racist. The color of your skin has nothing to do with your actions. Just because you're black doesn't mean you can't be racist. I've had people tell me, well, I'm Antifa. I can't be an extremist or a supremacist. Well, yes, you can. You could be, Antifa and still go firebomb someone or assault someone. Your political viewpoints don't make you, less extremist or less racist. There are racists and extremists that are both far right and far left. So this culture of being woke and saying, well, I'm a certain thing, so I can't be something else. That's not how that works. I'm, openly admitted that I'm a former white supremacist who now speaks out against hate groups and racism. And I've done videos on black racists, black Hebrew Israelites, the 5% nation of gods and earths. They have people in those groups that are vehemently racist. So these social justice warriors out there telling me that, oh, well, you can't call black people racist. Yes, I can. If you want to tell me that I'm wrong for doing that, well, that's your opinion, but I'm still going to do it.
Yeah, what seems to have happened is that they've changed the rules of engagement, whereas originally you could have just as easily said that the definition of racism, based on how most people define it, based on how it's defined in the dictionary actually, is believing that one race is superior or inferior to another. Yeah. But they've changed that. They've changed the definition of racism to include power structures. You can have a conversation about power dynamics that are at play in a society without having to change the definition. This just seems like you're doing so for the sake of promoting your own personal narrative.
Yeah.
And as Bruce said, we're all here for social justice. We're not arguing whether or not people should be treated equally. Of course we all believe that. Of course we're all against racism. The problem comes when you have a flawed methodology. One of the things that I've been doing these past couple of days now, or probably a week at this point, is arguing against what's been referred to as critical social justice. So I'm trying to attack it from the academy. And just recently, for instance, I mentioned that I just finished my summer classes. The book that we were not forced to read, it actually was for extra credit. The book that we were to read if we wanted to get extra credit in the class was White Fragility. And we had to read it in our reading groups. Now, I did my best, right? I did my best to argue against it. It was literally me versus the entire class here. And
oh boy.
Yeah, it was quite a bit of fun. Luckily, I still ended up getting an A in the class, so I was a bit worried that maybe my stance might hamper my grade, but luckily the proctor was very nice about everything. But what I noticed was that it wasn't a matter of us necessarily arguing about the way that we should be treating people necessarily. It was about our methods of getting an equal society. So whereas I would say the best methodology would to act colorblind, act as if you don't see race, even though obviously there are studies out there that show that we are conditioned socially to be biased in favor of white people over people of color. The best way to go about ending that is to try to override our biases, right? So just say that, like, even though I recognize that I have biases that make me prioritize one race or over another, I need to recognize that bias and do whatever I can to make sure that I'm acting in a way that is in accordance with a colorblind society. That's what I think is the best methodology. What they would say is, no, instead, you need to turn the tables on power dynamics. That to me is disastrous. And so that's what I've been trying to focus on. And I want to know your thoughts on this, because I am very pessimistic about the direction that society is headed in right now when it comes to talking about race, especially with what just occurred with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's great that people are now focusing on the topic of race and having honest conversations about it. However, what I am seeing is dishonest conversations being had about it. I'm not seeing people like John McWhorter being praised. I'm not seeing people recognize that maybe we need to think about the biases that we have. Instead, what I'm seeing are books like White Fragility being passed around, books like Me and White Supremacy being passed around, people saying that Black people can't be racist towards white people, which is incredibly demeaning. You're basically putting them at a lower expectation than white people. So what are your thoughts on this? What do you think is the future of race? Should we focus on just our humanity, or is there room for sort of recognizing that maybe we can appreciate our cultural background and have things like Black pride or Hispanic pride or something like that?
Well, especially now, since like even facts are being ignored. Like we're ignoring like how successful people of people of color are actually in our society. If you look at some of the stats, I think Indian Americans make almost twice the amount of median income that white people do, and white people are not even the richest according to some stats. White people aren't even the richest ethnic. The well-meaning to do I'm butchering what I'm saying here. I'm sorry. They're not doing. They're the ethnicity that's not even doing the best out of this supposedly white supremacist society we have. So facts are being ignored. So this is like a cult now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. As far as any of that goes, there is without a doubt systemic racism in the United States. And I think, what people need to do, and like you said, Vincent, is not only stop looking at, race per se, view everyone as human, but at the same time, we definitely need to reform our system as a whole, not just, our political system or our judicial system or the police or anything. I don't know why my lights keep flashing like that, but but yeah, we need to reform our entire system in this country. And yes, for forever in this country, people of minorities have been excluded to a large extent in participating, within our government and higher systems. Now, I know people are going to say, oh, well, look at AOC. She got elected. She's a minority. Right. But how many other women or how many other minorities actually get to that kind of level? It's tough because you don't want to come off as pushing minorities more than you're pushing white people because, well, now you're a racist for the other side. And people need to stop thinking that. I want people to understand that if you're born here or if you have a green card here, you're American. If you're a citizen of this country, you're American. I don't care what your ethnicity is. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care what your gender or gender identity is. Americans should all have the same equal rights, and those rights should be enforced. When they're violated, that should be enforced as breaking the law. It's not that hard to figure out. The hard thing to figure out is how do we make sure that people's rights are being respected? And how do we enforce the law when someone's rights are being violated? That I can't answer. I'm not a very good politician. I'm better at punching stuff. So
that's a good way of looking at it, right? So there are things that we all agree need a change, right? When you look at the incarceration gap between whites and blacks for the same crime, it's astonishing, right?
Yeah.
So these are
not to interrupt you, but I have to say this because you just brought it up. It was brought to my attention earlier from a man named T.M. Garrett that there's a man in Louisiana right now who just got sentenced to life in prison for stealing a pair of manual hedge clippers because he's got a former record. They gave him 3 strikes and sentenced him to life in prison for hedge clippers. That needs to change. That is ridiculous.
Yeah. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that, we need to make sure that there are absolutely no barriers to any job, regardless of what your race or gender is, right? So that to me is the main thing that we need to focus on. At the same time, we also shouldn't ignore whether or not there are differences in the way that different groups of cultures value one thing over the other. So one of the things that I often say is that for my specific culture, which is the Hispanic culture, I know for a fact that we do not value education as much as Asians do, or as much as white people do. So when we look at the fact that Hispanics consistently score lower on standardized testing, they have lower average GPAs. First we have to make sure that there are no systemic reasons behind that, right? And then once we recognize that, we also have to say, well, if we want to reach a particular goal, we need to inspect ourselves, right? We need to make sure that we value education as much as other cultures do, if we want to make sure that we want to succeed as much as other places are doing. I think that's an important conversation to have. But as you put it, rightfully so, we also need to focus on whether or not there are any barriers in place, right?
Yeah.
So you can't ignore one and acknowledge the other. This is why I sometimes get annoyed by people like Glenn Lowry, which, as much as I really admire him and I appreciate the work that he's been doing, I think he simplifies the things. So when he says, well, the problem is black on black crime, the problem is this and that, it's like, well, yeah, that's a problem, but at the same time, what are the socioeconomic factors that led to that? There's a reason why those statistics are as high as they are. You could ask whether or not it's part of culture, sure, but at the same time, what were the conditions that led to that? What are the ramifications from slavery that the Black community is still facing today? What are the ramifications of Jim Crow that the Black people are still facing today? Those are things that we need to analyze the situation from every angle. So you can't ignore the systemic aspect of it, but you also can't turn a blind eye to whether or not there are some cultural implications from it. And now when I talk about culture, I specifically speak from the Hispanic community. I'm not Black. I don't have any experience there. So I let people like John McWhorter talk about that. But on the problem of nationalism, right? So I asked specifically, is there, in the future, do we simply focus on our collective selves as the human race, or do you think that there could be some room for some national pride there? And this leads into the question of nationalism. What are your thoughts on nationalism and whether or not we can have pride in something like, being an American or being a German or being a French person?
Yeah, I have spoken about this a little bit in some of my videos. A lot of people, when they think of nationalism, they think, of it goes straight back to World War II and think of good old Adolf. That's not what I mean when I say, nationalism or national pride. And yes, we all do need to view each other as one human race, which is what my little symbol is back here on the wall that I made up. That's to symbolize one human race. But we are all still Americans. And if we want this country to survive and we want these constitutional rights that everybody says they deserve, then we need to view each other as Americans. Now, these extremists that talk about nationalism and say, oh, our race is our nation, we need to figure out, some way to deal with that. I don't want to take away people's First Amendment rights, but at some point you have to determine if what they're saying is going to lead to harm. Are they pushing a dangerous narrative? Are they calling for, the harm of others? And if they are, that needs to be viewed as a crime. We have plenty of Western countries. The UK is a perfect example. You cannot legally use hate speech. And we need to start thinking about maybe adopting some of those laws. And, looking at some of the things they do in those countries that, people say they do have more equality. How do we get to that point? And that may bridge the gap between, people that are supposedly in a better class system than others. I've never been in that high class system. I'm still trying to get there. So I'm not sure how we bridge that gap, because if I try and, work my way up to that class system, well, now I have people below me telling me, oh, well, you're so privileged, you don't understand. I came from nothing. Everything I have, I worked my butt off for. This isn't privilege. This is hard work, and this is my reward. So I struggle with that whole privilege thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, yes, do I have white privilege to walk down the street and not have a cop following me? Yeah. Can I go to Walmart and not be accused of, shoplifting? Yeah. So I understand that part of the white privilege, but people telling me that I had a better education or, I had a better upbringing and better health care and everything else because I was white, that's not always inherently true because I grew up dirt poor and we didn't go to the doctor unless we were dying. So it's hard. I don't know. I mean, I get it, but I think if people stop looking at race as, so much and realize that it is a class struggle as much as a racist struggle and bring those two ideas together, we might actually reach our goals a whole lot quicker, to bringing about true equality in this country.
Grumpy, you actually gave me the perfect segue into into the next subject that I wanted to discuss with you. The one of the videos that you put out recently was about the Nation of Islam.
Yeah.
Putting it lightly, it's a very, very controversial organization that in the video you showed yesterday, it demonstrated how they were pushing for black separation, and it has anti-Semitic leaders like Louis Farrakhan. What I found impressive about you is that you go after racism no matter what ethnic group it comes from. Yep. Racism is racism. It deserves to be it deserves to be fought and trashed no matter what ethnic group espouses it. Now we're in 2020, and I'm almost convinced that we're living in the twilight zone because, as we were talking about before, there's some people who say you can't be you can't be racist against white people. Now you were talking about privilege earlier. Now the whole white privilege phraseology, the idea is used just to steamroll any criticism against the idea that we're living in anything but a white supremacist culture nowadays. But I think that's disingenuous. Although I believe that white privilege does exist, it's also overblown. And for instance, on Twitter and some other social media sites, I've seen some people actually argue that, like yourself, if you're dirt poor, you'll always have the advantage of being looked upon more favorably because of your skin color. And you will always have that advantage. But if you're in a very, very poor geographic location in this country or come from a very, very poor social status, that's really not much of an advantage as opposed to someone who comes from another ethnicity, who lives in a different area of the world, that has the advantages of education, comes from a better social economic background. They have arguably so much more advantage than the person who is looked upon more favorably because of his skin color. So that just seems to be an overly simplistic way of breaking down how someone can succeed. And speaking from that sole aspect, white privilege almost seems like a racist concept in itself. Like, what are your thoughts in this area?
Sometimes I have seen people, use that as a racial attack. And I'm not sure if it's simply because they don't truly understand what, white privilege is, or just because they want to be racist because, well, white people did it first. Now it's my turn. And we should have all learned, by first or second grade that just because Timmy does it first doesn't mean it's okay for you to do it now. I do see some people use that, like I said, as a racial attack. I think for the most part, though, that especially here in the United States, that yes, there is a form of white privilege. Like I said, I know I could walk into any Walmart pretty much anywhere in this country and wouldn't have to worry about anybody following me around thinking that I'm going to shoplift. Whereas in the area where I live, which is predominantly Christian and filled with Trump supporters, if one of the local, people of color walk into the Walmart, 9 out of 10 times, somebody's going to follow them, at least for most of their time in the store. And I've seen it. I've witnessed that. And I've actually spoken out against it. So, yeah, there is a form of white privilege in this country. And of course, there's white supremacy in this country. But I don't think it's as what's the word I'm looking for? I don't think it's as big as some people want to make it out to be, because like you were saying, you know, if you come from a lower class, you know, family, a lower income, socioeconomic family, you're not going to have as many advantages as, you know, someone of color like Barack Obama. I'll never have that kind of advantage. It's not going to happen. I'm too old to get to that point in my life. But it still doesn't take away that, yes, there is systemic racism and there is a form of white privilege, but people need to stop weaponizing that term.
Well, I've once referred to like a book like White Fragility as 100% weapons grade bullshit. So I can see where you're coming from there. Going back to the subject of people going into groups and especially religion, these quote unquote so-called anti-racists seem to be more interested in like regrouping people by skin color nowadays, which is toxic. But I want to bring up the idea of groups once again, because when we talk about groups, like they aren't necessarily horrible in themselves, but one of the things I've heard someone say once is that if you group someone by something as toxic as, say, an oversimplification of racial identity, but if you group that can lead to very, very deleterious effects in society. But if you group people by who decide to group together under a set of ideas that are fundamentally good, treat people as you want to be treated, like look at people as individuals, no matter what the skin color comes from, treat everyone fairly, that's actually a good thing. So with the idea that we're all human and humans who have evolutionary psychological aspects to need to cluster together, to group together, do you think there's value in that kind of in grouping together, not so much by racial identity, but by, say, not even by nationalities, but by a common set of ideas? Like we all share a common humanity, like humanism, for example. Like that seems to be where we need to move in the future if we want to go into a society that's colorblind, and that just seems to be like where we want to go to if we want to achieve a culture that can get past racial bias.
Yeah, to a certain extent. I have come across certain groups that claim to be anti-racist, and they have, you know, white people, black people, Latinos, all in this same group. But at the same time, they're calling for, you know, going to actual war against white people. And it's like, you know, do you not hear what you're saying? You say you left, you know, extreme. Now, some of these people are former white supremacists, and they've gone to the other side now, like I have, except they've gone way to the other side. They're not white supremacists anymore, but they're still pushing extremist ideas on how to battle against white supremacy.
Right.
Talking about, you know, they should all be executed and things like that. And it's like, no, like what happened to dialogue here? You know, you're still pushing extremist ideas. That's not okay. And then, of course, I get called a bootlicker and whatever else. So, you know, I get attacked from both sides. One side tells me I'm a race traitor and, you know, I just want to be a heathen with, you know, all the colored people. The other side tells me I'm a bootlicker and I don't care about, people of color, whatever. If you're pushing extremist ideas, you're wrong. It's just that simple. Everybody, and I've said this, I know I said it in a video, I can't remember which one, but I specifically said Black people need to stop telling white people we shouldn't be talking, because people like me should be talking, and everybody needs to listen. Not just white people, Black people need to listen. Latino people need to listen. Everybody needs to listen, because there is a reason why white people are starting more and more to gravitate towards these hateful groups, because they're scared. And if they don't have to be scared, you need to tell them that. But before you can tell them that, you need to be able to hear them and listen to them tell you that they're scared. And if you're not listening, you cannot help them.
It's been a while since we've spoken. Yeah. It's been a while since we've spoken poorly about Trump, so I want to get back to that.
My favorite orange idiot.
Yeah, he's quite something. Usually when we talk about him in the past, we've talked about him in regards to the rise of right-wing populism, or his complete incapability of recognizing that we're going through a pandemic until 3 months in. And so what I wanted to ask is, there seems to have been an uptick in people joining these right-wing hate groups. And do you think that this is a byproduct of Trump winning, or do you think Trump winning is a byproduct of people joining these right-wing hate groups?
No, there's definitely a rise due to Trump winning.
Mm-hmm.
He's played politics, and I say played politics because I don't think he's an actual politician. I think he's a megalomaniac who has this idea that he's never going to have to leave that office. Since he's been president, there have been 1,012 new hate groups in the United States. These aren't just offshoots. These aren't people that said, oh, well, this group's getting too big, so we're going to form a second group. These are new hate groups with new leadership and new members. I have to say that that's because of Trump, because he did away with certain things. He changed certain things within our law that made it easier for these groups to form and become legally nonprofit groups. They're hate groups. They're blatantly racist in their rhetoric and in everything they write, their websites, the whole 9 yards. And now they're allowed to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is why there's, people often say, well, can you prove that Trump is a racist? I can't prove it. I don't know if he is a racist. I'm inclined to believe he is, but there's a problem when he's using the same exact rhetoric that white supremacists use, or at the very least, he's using rhetoric that white supremacists would agree with. So whereas someone like Joe Biden or someone like Bernie Sanders, these are people that, even if they're hidden racists, they're not saying things that racists would agree with. And with Trump, even if he's not a racist, he is saying things that racists would agree with. So there's a problem there. And I wish this problem were only isolated to the United States, but as we've seen, there's an increase in right-wing populism in Western Europe, so now we have to be concerned about that. And so this is why it sometimes irks me when people just go full-on only attacking the left, saying the left is the problem, right? The Dave Rubins of the world that say, I don't see right-wing extremism being a problem. What are you talking about? Have you been completely blind to what's been going on in Western Europe? Have you been completely blind to what's going on in populism? Both of these things need to be attacked. And it's so weird when people only focus on one thing. You can focus on both. It's not that hard. Or at the very least, even if you do choose to use your resources to one issue because you think that's the bigger issue, don't pretend like the other one isn't an issue at all. Of course it's an issue.
And his rhetoric has really emboldened, I would say, those hate groups, as I think you would say, Grumpy. Like after Charlottesville, where he did not condemn the people in the racists. He said there are quote unquote very fine people on both sides. What are you talking about? It's like whether or not he's actually a racist, he did play irresponsibly with the kind of rhetoric in that with the culture, and that just opens a door for what's happening for what's happening now. It's something else.
Telling the groups that were involved with Charlottesville that, well, they have a right to free speech. Okay, but they don't have a right to run a car through a crowd.
Exactly.
Really? Did you miss that somehow? Yeah, he is definitely let it be known. And I said this as soon as I heard his slogan, "Make America Great Again." One of my first thoughts was, does nobody remember the beginning of World War II when a certain somebody said, "Make Germany great again"? Is that just coincidence? Am I looking too much into it, or is there actually something there?
Yeah. I want to end off this conversation by talking about identity politics, because you cannot have a conversation about race without addressing identity politics. So the argument for it is that racial progress has not been made in our history by not focusing on the politics of a particular group. So Robin DiAngelo, in the introduction to her book, White Fragility, specifically says that the reason why Black people got rights was because of identity politics, because we focused on their collective grievances and we politicized it. So what are your thoughts on identity politics as a whole? Do you see it generally as a net good, or do the bad things about identity politics, such as making things solely about race, making things solely about us versus them mentality, which Jonathan Haidt refers to as one of the great untruths of society, or does the bad things about it overwhelm the good things, or do the good things about it overwhelm the bad things?
I would say, as with anything, you have good and bad people. The ideas could be good, but people are going to, twist them around and weaponize them and make them into something bad. So it really all depends on who's pushing that narrative. Should we focus on, people of color and, and Black people in particular to revamp our politics? I don't think so. No. I think that's going to lead us down a long road of a lot of bad things, because Black people are not the only minority in this country. And we need to push that. It's all minorities, and I understand the whole concept with Black Lives Matter, and I'm not trying to detract from that at all, because it's, if anybody knows how to do math, yes, Black Lives Matter was founded because Black people are shot and killed by police at a higher rate than any other ethnicity in this country. So not trying to take away from that, but we need to focus on every ethnicity in this country as a whole. We have to get back to that somehow, that everyone here is an American. And it's not just the Americans that we need to focus on. We need to focus on these camps that are set up for supposed illegal immigrants. Did they cross the border illegally? Maybe. But treating them inhuman is not helping. That's just making us look that much worse. It's making this country look that much more racist. We have to end things like this. We have to start looking at our own past record into human rights violations and deal with it, and own it, fess up. Like I know there are people in the government that know they've made mistakes. Own it. Take credit for your mistakes and say, okay, it's time for us to do better.
Yeah. What you just said right there is a perfect way to describe liberal enlightenment values, that there has to be some external mechanism that allows us to understand reality, that allows us to recognize how we should be treating people. And you don't need identity politics for that.
Yeah.
You don't need to focus solely on race to recognize that we all deserve to be treated equally. And that's why one of the things I champion are liberal enlightenment values. This is the one thing that we need to focus on. And so, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, what I've been arguing against this past week is critical methods, and specifically critical race theory, which argues against liberal enlightenment values. And that's not me putting words in their mouths. They say this in their own literature, in their own peer-reviewed papers. They are against the idea that we can easily obtain an understanding of objective reality. So that's what I'm arguing against. But any closing thoughts that you have before we shut it off?
I just, same thing I tell everybody on my channel. I want you to try and take care of yourselves, try and take care of one another, and just be human.
Mm-hmm. That's good. So where
Awesome.
can people find you, by the way? Anything you want to publicize, your Twitter, your YouTube, Facebook, whatever it may be?
You can find me on YouTube at Grumpy Old Dude. I am now doing a Patreon. I have 2 tiers. I have a $1 tier and a $2 tier, keeping it cheap.
Yeah.
All right. So the links to all that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Grumpy Old Dude 8, and you can find me on Facebook. I have a page and a group that you don't even have to answer any questions to get in my group. You can just decide to join my group.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
Okay.
All the links to that will be in the description of the video below. So please go ahead, everyone, follow him, subscribe to him. There are a few people here that I always say that I want them to get more recognition. You're certainly one of them after I saw your appearance on the Dave Worley podcast.
Right.
You have an incredibly unique and interesting history that I think can be very informative for people, especially when recognizing the dangers of, as you mentioned, right-wing identitarian terrorist groups. So this is very important work that you're doing, and I appreciate that, and I'm glad to finally have you on the podcast. So thanks for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute honor. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. We had a good chat.
Grumpy.
Nice. Thank you.